You know that quote you sent in from the Emir of Dubai about the camels and the Mercedes? It really got me thinking about how power shifts around, especially when we talk about global currencies.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful analogy. What goes up must come down, right? Even the systems that seem untouchable.
Exactly. And that leads perfectly into what we're diving into today, the petrodollar. We're going to try to understand this whole system, how it came to be, and what might be on the horizon for it. And let me tell you, after digging into Andranik Aghazarian's Cold War 2.0, it's a wild ride.
It's way more than just oil, right? It's about how one commodity got so tangled up with global power affecting everything. I mean, we're talking international relations to the price we pay for gas.
Okay, so rewind the clock a bit. It's post-World War II, right? The U.S. is sitting pretty, holding a big chunk of the world's gold. What's the global scene like back then?
Imagine a world still picking up the pieces after the war. Everyone's kind of desperate for things to be, well, stable. They need a system to avoid another global conflict.
Right, and that's where this Bretton Woods Agreement pops up. I gotta admit, before this deep dive, I thought it was some fancy Gulf resort, not a turning point in financial history.
Yeah, but a turning point it was. Picture it. 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. You've got these representatives from 44 allied nations, and they're basically there to create a whole new system for money, a global one. They decided to peg most of the major currencies to the U.S. dollar, which at the time you could directly swap for gold.
So the U.S. dollar became like the main pillar holding up the global financial system.
Exactly. It brought this sense of, well, stability and predictability to a world that desperately needed it after the war. But here's where it gets interesting, especially for those countries producing oil, many of whom had just taken control of their own oil industries.
Which I imagine made them vulnerable, right?
Absolutely. Now they were at the mercy of global oil prices, which, let's be honest, could swing wildly. So, pegging their currencies to a nice, stable U.S. dollar, it gave them a safety net against those crazy price swings.
So it was a win-win. The U.S. gets to solidify the dollar's top dog status, and the oil-producing nations get some much-needed financial security.
Basically, yeah, it was like this mutually beneficial thing. At least it seemed that way for a while. But as with anything, there are always hiccups along the way, unintended consequences. And those played a big part in how this whole petrodollar thing really cemented itself.
See, that's what gets me. It wasn't just a straight shot from A to B. There were shocks, curveballs, power plays, all this stuff that really locked the dollar into place.
Oh, absolutely. And to really grasp that, we've got to fast forward a bit to the 1970s, a decade marked by, oil embargoes, geopolitical chaos, and this growing realization that oil-producing nations, they had some serious leverage on the world stage.
Right, the 1970s it is. Sounds like things are about to get a little heated.
Heated is an understatement. 1973 hits, and the oil embargo, right, it really threw the world economy for a loop. Suddenly, these oil-producing countries, those OPEC nations especially, realized, hey, we've got some serious power here.
It's crazy how one event can just completely change the game. So what happened right after the embargo? Like, how did it hit everyone?
Well, for the countries used to guzzling down that oil, like the U.S., it was a wake-up call. They depended on those imports, and that sudden cutoff, it sent shockwaves through their economies, let me tell you.
Makes sense. So what does the U.S. do? Aghazarian's book talks about a pretty strategic move on their part, something that basically secured the petrodollar's place for decades.
Right on. The U.S. reached out to Saudi Arabia, the big dog in OPEC. It wasn't anything official, mind you, not a treaty or anything, but it was an understanding, and that understanding had massive consequences.
This is what some analysts call the petrodollar union, isn't it?
Exactly. Basically, the U.S. offered military support, security guarantees, that sort of thing. And in return, Saudi Arabia would make sure that all OPEC oil sales, they had to be done in U.S. dollars.
Hold on. So even if other currencies were available, if you wanted OPEC oil, you needed U.S. dollars.
You got it. Think about what that meant. It created this constant global demand for U.S. dollars, boosting its value and making it even more the currency, the world's reserve currency. It was a power move, no doubt, using military muscle to shape how money flowed around the world.
Sounds like a win-win for the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, at least at first glance. But Aghazarian also hints at some cracks in this whole setup. He even mentions, veiled threats from the Saudis themselves. What's that all about?
Well, as time went on, that whole dependence on the U.S. dollar, it started to feel less like a benefit and more like a burden for some of these oil-producing countries, Saudi Arabia included.
How so? I mean, didn't the stable dollar help them out?
It did initially, but it also meant they were tied to whatever the U.S. was doing with its monetary policy. If the dollar's value went up or down, they were stuck riding that roller coaster. No control.
So they wanted more freedom, more say in their own economic future.
Exactly. They started looking for ways to branch out, diversify what they were holding, and rely less on the U.S. dollar. They wanted to steer their own ships, basically.
It's like that quote we talked about earlier about how power shifts around. Even the strongest alliances can get shaky when that balance starts to tip, right?
Mm-hmm. You said it. And it's not just the oil-producing countries looking for more wiggle room. Aghazarian also gets into some of the tactics the U.S. has considered to keep its hold on the petrodollar. One of the more controversial ones is this thing called the NOPEC bill.
Okay, break that down for us. What is NOPEC, and what's it supposed to do? This NOPEC thing sounds kind of intense, like a power move in itself. Is it basically the U.S. saying, hey, OPEC, don't even think about stepping out of line?
Well, it's definitely a way for the U.S. to try and maintain some control, yeah. So NOPEC stands for No Oil Producing and Exporting Cartels Act, right? And it's been kicking around Congress for ages, but never actually become law. Basically, it'd let the U.S. go after OPEC in court.
Really? How would that work? I thought those OPEC countries were, like, untouchable because of sovereign immunity and all that.
That's the thing. They are, or at least they have been. But NOPEC, it'd change U.S. antitrust laws, specifically to take away that protection for OPEC.
So say OPEC tries another embargo, jacks up the prices again, the U.S. could just sue them.
Exactly. Hit them with a lawsuit for price fixing, market manipulation, the whole 9 yards. It'd be a way for the U.S. to exert its influence, protect the whole petrodollar system,
But doesn't that seem risky? Like, wouldn't that make things even more unstable?
That's the double-edged sword Aghazarian talks about. You start poking the bear, who knows how it'll react? What if OPEC retaliates, cuts production? Or what if they start doing business in other currencies, ditch the dollar altogether?
Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Right. It really makes you wonder, is the petrodollar as invincible as it seems? Or are we seeing the first cracks in its foundation?
Yeah.
Are we headed towards a world where multiple currencies call the shots?
That's the big question, isn't it? What do you think? Is the petrodollar system on its way out?
It's tough to say for sure, but it's definitely facing challenges, that's for sure. Look at China, Russia. They're pushing their own currencies on the world stage. We're talking deals to buy oil in yuan, in rubles even.
And Aghazarian seems to think this trend is only going to pick up steam, right? This whole idea of a power shift, moving away from a U.S.-centric system to something more, I don't know, fragmented. What does that even look like for everyday people?
Well, for starters, it probably means things get a bit more volatile. Currency markets, prices on imported goods, global trade, all that. It's all connected, and it could be a bumpy ride. It also means we've got to get used to a world where economic power is spread around more, not just concentrated in one place.
So no more U.S. dollar reigning supreme.
It's not going to disappear overnight, but those days of total domination, those might be numbered. And that has big implications for everyone.
This has been a wild ride. Really makes you think. Going back to that quote about the camels and the Mercedes, what will this new world order look like? Will it be a smooth transition, or are we in for a bumpy ride?
The million-dollar question, right? And unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. But one thing's for sure, understanding what makes this whole system tick, the oil, the currencies, the power dynamics, that's the key to navigating whatever comes next.
Couldn't agree more.